Well, welcome to another DGauge podcast. And today we're looking to get views on another topical issue in the rail industry through the lens of engineering. And this often, of course, doesn't align with popular messages. We've had quite a few contributions from people on one of the most topical issues so far, and that's how we might get to a net zero carbon by 2020 in the UK, and the role that rail can play in this. So today, my special guest is Alex Burrows, who's the Director of the Commercial and Professional Services team at the Birmingham Centre for Rail Research and Education, and also Managing Director of the Rail Alliance, which is the UK's specialist rail SME network. So Alex, you're most welcome.
Thank you very much for having me. Look forward to joining you.
Thank you. Okay, well, getting straight on with the questions that I've thought of and which hopefully you've got some views on. First one is to look at the whole rail industry seems to be agreed that electrification is the future because it enables efficient use of renewable energy. But there seems to be divisions as to how we might get there, and perhaps more importantly, how we'll deal with those places where it would simply be unfeasible, unrealistic to electrify. So I wonder how you see the picture unfolding as we head towards 2050.
Yeah, this is a good, healthy debates taking place on this discussion. So I think we can all agree, first of all, that rail decarbonisation is a very important goal, and one I think we can all sign up to quite happily. And it's interesting, really, isn't it, that transport's become the largest emitter of greenhouse gases. It would say overtook energy. Energy undertook transport by significantly decarbonising their source, their production of energy, and now transport's the biggest emitter. But of course, rail's only a very small part of that. And you think that rail provides, from memory, rail provides about 10% of passenger and freight movements, but only about 2% of emissions. Rail is the most efficient form of transport, and we should always frame these kinds of discussion with a view that the moving freight by rail, for example, one freight train takes off 70-80 lorries. So even a diesel freight train is vastly more energy efficient and carbon friendly compared to its equivalents. But I think even saying that, there's more we can do, and we do need to get rid of diesel. I think, for example, standing on the platforms at Birmingham New Street Station, under the covers there with diesel trains. Well, yeah, you've done it too, I guess.
I have indeed, yes.
I won't identify the trains because obviously all diesel trains are the same. They're all pumping out lots of nasty things from a punter's perspective. It's unhealthy, and it's unhealthy for the staff who work there as well as for the passenger, and it just isn't a good look for the railway, quite frankly. We need to get rid of diesel, and the sooner the better. I suppose it's frustrating, isn't it, that we have our internal battles around how we're going to do that. I think if we can try and identify where we're all in agreement, and then how we get a plan that everyone can buy into, and certainly we want to see net zero by 2050, and if that means 80% of the railway network is electrified in the sense of overhead line equipment electrified, then from a UK perspective, that will be an excellent rate of progress. I fear I'm slightly sceptical of that happening. I think all of us can give our experience of the UK government, Department for Transport, and its I suppose rate of progress. I wouldn't say it's around single decisions at any particular point in time. It's more the case of the actual rate of progress for making electrification happen has been stop-start, to give it the very best description, and it hasn't given us a nice rhythm of ongoing electrification like other governments in other countries have achieved. So, to my perspective, I want to see diesel off as quickly as possible. I don't think that we can hold on to improvements in combustion engines and diesel as being a realistic and viable answer for any kind of long-term perspective. It's now a case of tidying up what we've got left, but now phasing it out gradually and getting to clean technologies, not new technologies, but clean technologies, because batteries and hydrogen fuel cells, which we are inevitably going to talk about, these aren't radical new technologies as such. It's about developing them for a rail application. And so, to my mind, we need to work on the premise that overhead line equipment, rail infrastructure electrification, is the optimal answer for most applications. I think realistically, we aren't going to see overhead wires in every part of the rail network, certainly in our lifetimes. And I just don't want to make an assumption that we will, and that will end up leaving us with a legacy of bits and bobs that aren't best. So I'd like to see a proper committed strategy and plan that sees diesel gone by whatever means possible by I'll say 2040, but it should be even quicker than that, and there's no reason not to. We have the ability to do that, and I think we should really be expecting more from the DFT and Network Rail when it comes to plans for how we can replace diesel as quickly and cost effectively as possible.
Okay, that's interesting. I mean, it's a common message that I'm hearing, is in terms of, yes, that we need to consider the emissions of our diesel engines and things like that. And the point about Birmingham New Street is exceedingly well made. Many a happy hour spent under that canopy, I have to say.
Yeah.
But I mean, interesting. The other side of it is, looking at your figure for, what we could achieve in terms of electrification, that chimes pretty well with what a lot of other people believe, that 80%, if we can get to 80%, that'll be pretty good. And I think that some of the technologies that we're developing these days, not only in terms of the understanding of what electrification means in terms of the clearances we need for prevent flashovers and using the devices such as surge arresters and stuff like that, but the stuff that we've been doing at DGauge, which is looking at how we can reduce the clearance that we provide by understanding what we've actually got and making the most of it. There are still going to be some cases where we just simply cannot reasonably thread wires through. We look on places like Thameslink as being the, shall we say, the example of where we've managed to achieve very, very small electrical clearances. And I think Cardiff Intersection Bridge, that's a classic case of how we've done really well to get electrification in a place you wouldn't believe. But there's still going to be there's still an awful lot of places that are even tighter than that. So it does seem clear that, with the best will in the world, we are not going to be able to have pantographs up everywhere. And that suggests that we're going to need some sort of hybrid technology. I use hybrid in the loosest of sense. We've got our views on what hybrid is from the automotive industry, but of course, that needn't necessarily be the same as what we have. So to get us from electrified section to electrified section, we're going to need something to get us over the gap. And I question whether you see this as being similar to the existing sort of bi-mode intercity express trains, or might there be a better way of than lugging heavy diesel engines or whatever they happen to be in tanks of fuel around for the last mile or the in-between bits? What do you think?
Well, I think the bi-mode, the hybrid solution, is a very good one, and certainly when you think of the business case for getting the wires up, I mean, if we can make the best use of them as possible, and not having trains like we have now, the situation of diesel trains running for long distances under the wires, and I think of course traveling London to Birmingham and seeing West Coast super voyagers running on diesel at high speeds up the West Coast main line. Luckily, that particular example will be going soon because a bi-mode fleet is coming in, but we can go further than that a lot more easily. I certainly do believe, and it sounds like the plan is for those particular trains on the west, as indeed on the east and the Great Western main lines, that we can see those diesel engines being replaced by something different, perhaps battery, perhaps hydrogen, at some point in the future. But I think bi-mode is the hybrid solution is a sound one, and one we should be exploiting. But we shouldn't see clean diesel as anything more than a short transition step to something different. And certainly batteries have a very strong case for providing a hybrid traction system to cover the gaps, but they aren't going to cover all the gaps. There are going to be chunks of network that we are not going to see wires up for quite some time to come. And is battery technology going to provide the solution? Well, not really. I mean, the problem with batteries is they're very expensive, very heavy, and don't carry lots of energy with them, unfortunately. So they are a very good solution, but in certain particular circumstances. Likewise, hydrogen fuel cells are also a very good solution in certain particular circumstances, and we have plenty of work we can get on with in undertaking route simulation to accurately understand what technology is going to be best suited to where. And that's not to say we look at Network Rail's traction decarbonisation network strategy, which looks at it very holistically. We can undertake a much more granular route simulation and say, right, we could electrify certain parts of the network as well to optimize this, and then say which technology is going to be best suited to fill in those gaps, given the fleets that serve those particular routes as well. So we can get to a stage of designing in the best fleets for the best route simulation. And that needs to be done quite simply, because at the moment we seem to have a strategy that's saying, well, we're going to incrementally undertake electrification and hopefully get to these parts. And I say it with a fair degree of skepticism, because I know we've been talking around things like the Midland Main Line electrification to Sheffield for a long time, and that still isn't on the cards, frustratingly. I don't understand why it hasn't been done, quite honestly. And there are other cases like that, but we need to get on with more with certainty of where the wires are going to go, so we can then go into the process of looking at, well, what can we do to fill those gaps otherwise? We can't go on buying diesel bi-mode trains, and we need to get out of that habit before it becomes ingrained, I think, is a really important point. It frustrates me hugely that we have seen this response from the government of well, we're going to buy clean bi-modes, and that's going to provide this fantastic environmentally friendly solution for, these are trains that have got a 35-year design life, for goodness sake. So in 35 years time, 2056, those diesel engine bi-modes are going to be lugging their heavy diesel engines around, using them, and hopefully 80% of the network will be electrified as well. And again, skepticism comes on that too. It's not the right answer. It's only a transition. And it really frustrates. I'm getting quite excited about this now, but it does frustrate. It frustrates many people that we're talking about. We're still putting diesel engines in there as a long-term solution when they cannot be that.
Yeah. I mean, that's very interesting. A point I'll come on to is about some of the decisions that were made in terms of what bi-modes enabled. But clearly, one of the things you've picked up there is the fact that to understand what the mix should be and what should be done requires a degree of simulation. That's pretty academic stuff. And I think that one of the issues we have is that a lot of the decisions in terms of what we should be doing seem to be based on sort of empirical evidence and on people's, shall we say, perceptions of things, rather than necessarily what might be considered in the current climate as following the science. And clearly, you've got a lot of expertise within your grasp, and the industry as a whole has got a lot of academic excellence that could be used to actually come up with possibly a much more numerate approach to the sort of things that we see, whereby people are making arbitrary guesses as to where electrification might be. And perhaps if we did have that analysis, then it might demonstrate the folly of, for example, the fact that Midland Main Line remains to this day a diesel route, even though throughout at least half of my career we've been planning for it to be electrified. So I think that's quite an interesting perspective to consider what academic work could be done that might inform this better than the current, shall we say, arbitrary decisions that seem to be being made. But just to go back to your point on bi-modes, I mean, my frustration with Great Western, and I was quite heavily involved in the electrification process of that, was that if you like, the appearance of bi-modes suddenly gave the Department for Transport the opportunity to say that they didn't need to finish Great Western electrification.
Yes.
That we ended up with diesel trains going into Bristol Temple Meads, for example, a very small journey from the fundamentally electrified bits of route that were being electrified. But that was because, and I seem to remember it was a Secretary of State for Transport, who I think is still in post, said something along the lines of it was a much better solution, even though all of the mathematics suggested that in actual fact, the whole performance issues, if you looked at the system, suggested it wasn't a better solution. So what do you think about the economics of electrification? Do you think that might change? And do you think we might get to the situation in future where we are actually considering the last mile of electrification rather than say, well, actually, you've electrified to a certain point, you can roll downhill to your destination now? I wonder what you think about that.
Yeah, well, it's an extremely good point. I mean, you'd think that quite simply, where you've got a single fleet of trains, say serving Cardiff and Bristol, and that would be a dedicated fleet, that you'd want them to be electric, completely electric, and running on wires there and back. You know, electric trains are faster, smoother, quieter, cheaper to run. You know, need I go on? It's a better passenger experience there, and it's more cost effective as well. How you could say you don't want wires up to Cardiff and Bristol. Where do you start with that? But the economics surely supports and looking at a whole life cycle cost analysis. You would think that a dedicated fleet of high-speed trains running between Bristol and Cardiff and London, solely on electric and carrying at best a bit of ballast rather than a great big diesel engine and fuel tanks, is a vastly preferable solution. All right, you know, there may come that point of, well, you're going to carry ballast around, why not carry a diesel engine? And I say, well, why not carry ballast around that's not going to generate emissions compared to a diesel engine, which also then brings lots of moving parts and things to go wrong in the future. So I'd rather carry the ballast, thank you, than the diesel engine. And that surely is something that can be, when considered in a whole life cost analysis, heavily points towards the benefits of electrification. But I do think the cost of electrification will go down, is going down, in fact, and that lessons have been learnt from the Great Western. But the frustrating thing, of course, and I saw this point was very well made by I hesitate to call him a minor Twitter celebrity, because he's a major Twitter celebrity in rail electrification terms, Noel Dolphin, that you've got you are not going to benefit from lessons learned if you don't then put them into practice in the next project. And so we're going to go straight back to this cyclical boom and bust nature of, as soon as we might have derived any benefits in terms of not just lessons learned, but rolling on skills, rolling on production facilities into the next project, yet again, we're going to throw all of those benefits away and start with a clean slate, which will just lead to the same problems re-emerging 5, 10, 15 years down the line. So I think the government seems to be setting up electrification for a fall by constantly pausing it rather than committing, supporting for the long term and nurturing it as something we can take forward and invest in and benefit from long term. Because let's remember, the point of electrification is to provide better train services to passengers, to customers. And I don't know, sometimes it feels that gets lost in the ether of a relatively technical and I still think not, I think you're right, not taking the full circumstances into account of the benefits of electrifying. And to answer that, the other point you made, yes, and we absolutely, at University of Birmingham and a number of other universities across the UK Rail Research Innovation Network, UCRIN, we provide the modelling and simulation capability that can very easily demonstrate an optimal solution, an optimal strategy for electrifying, and for what complementary technologies you could use to deploy that. And we've done that exercise in Germany, for example. We await the chance to do it in great detail across the UK network.
Thank you for that. That's I'm reminded of one of the biggest arguments that I heard at the beginning of the Great Western electrification in favour of it was that the saving in costs associated with not having diesel engines that you had to service and look after and nourish and nurture was one of the biggest things, that electric traction was cheaper and much more easy to maintain, much more reliable, etc.
Yep.
And we seem to lose sight of that. So it is kind of interesting. But I mean, you've just made the point about the experience for passengers. And electrification has always been something that has enabled us to have better train services. The various effects we've seen over the years when electrification is introduced. I mean, for example, the electrification of the West Coast Main Line, first of all, major improvements there in that service, but also East Coast Main Line, the introduction of Intercity 225s, all those sort of things, really did change the passenger experience. But of course, it's not all about passengers, is it? Some of it's about freight. We've got a freight network, and some are saying that, in the immediate post-COVID aftermath, there may be that we've got the opportunity to really start to develop our freight network, not the least being to attack some of the latest forms of freight, the sort of package type freight, as opposed to necessarily heavy freight, looking more about what we do with containers. But of course, a lot of the freight routes do run where we're probably never going to be looking at putting wires. So there is the issue of heavy freight trains are a different kettle of fish to the passenger trains, and I think a significant challenge. And also, of course, there's the additional consideration that when you start to talk about weight, people like locomotives to have lots of weight because it gives extra tractive effort. And we're certainly seeing some of the latest locomotives coming out that are using weight to their advantage. So, you're going to end up with your proverbial concrete blocks as opposed to diesel engines in those things. But what do you think about freight, and how are we going to take freight forward in this, shall we say, hybrid era that we're looking at in terms of moving forward? What do you think in terms of freight, Alex?
So I'm freight. Just to go back to that think of it in the context of that last point and the whole life cost analysis, and freight gets missed out of that equation, I fear. And certainly the value that rail freight brings is not properly factored into decision making, quite simply. And the other point is the structural complexity of the rail sector, and I suppose the bias towards passenger services in particular that we have in the UK means that private rail freight operators really have to go it alone. They face battles very different to train operating companies because they're working in a deregulated market, so they have to earn their money for themselves with the context they're given, and it doesn't feel like they're supported in any kind of way by the Department for Transport. And this idea that freight's going to have to electrify itself when they're not being given consideration for rail freight routes to be electrified is it's barking, quite frankly, isn't it? I mean, I don't really know how else to frame it, to be honest. And certainly, I'm really interested in seeing the development of the high-speed parcels operations that are coming through. And I know of at least 2 private operators coming into play with those services, which I think is it's a fascinating development for starters, and I very much hope it will be a very successful development as well, and I'm sure it will be. But I think it would be a huge waste if operations like those were stymied in some way because they weren't able to access all electric routes and electric traction to make it cost effective for them to operate. So I think for starters, they should be put on a par or somehow equated to passenger rail from a Department for Transport perspective in order to be seen as equally valuable, given the decarbonisation and the decongestion of traffic networks, of taking a lot of these parcels off the road. So it's crazy not to. But then going up to the big heavy stuff, it's not impossible to find a way around this. It's complex, and I don't want to simplify it to then look like, this is an easy problem to solve, because it isn't. But there are certain things that can be done, like strategic rail freight network being a priority for electrification, and then offering some kind of line haul support locomotives that can come in, be they hydrogen, battery, clean diesel, vegetable oil. I'll be agnostic for now on this point, but of providing a route from electric network, shuttle haulage service out to the ports, out to the terminal, out to that unelectrified part that you rightly say is not going to get electrified because A, the government won't do it, and B, if the government expects private operations to do it, they've even got less of a business case to make that work, quite frankly. So that would just be daft for the government to try and make that the case. But there's also the element that what the government could do with this, which is with long-term policy certainty and a long-term committed strategy, then the market can respond to that. But the government's created the worst of all worlds because, quite frankly, no one knows what's going to happen. No one knows what to expect. And you can't invest in a long-term market where you have absolutely no certainty of what the agenda is going to be in 5 years, let alone 20 or 50 years. So we aren't going to see private investment in electrification. We aren't going to see private investment in new routes. We're not going to see significant investment in research and development in clean technologies for the railway, when no one knows what the next decision is going to be. And that really is the nub of the problem.
Interesting. Yeah, well, thank you for that perspective. I think there's a common thread coming out of a lot of this, and that is that if you like, we don't really seem to embrace what the long-term strategy is beyond. We wish to get down to zero net carbon, but to actually get to that, there's a lot of things we need to know about in order to come up with the correct strategy to get to there. If we aren't going to end up with the same sort of decisions that were made in the latter days of Great Western, where we suddenly went for bimodes as a solution that was, I don't think very many people, apart from perhaps Hitachi, who benefited from last minute orders for new mods to trains. I don't think many other people benefited from that decision. So, but I think we could go on for a long time with this, Alex. As you know, we're getting enthusiastic now. But I obviously have to keep these to a certain length of time because I'm under a whip to not get carried away.
Okay.
So I've got one more question that I'd like to ask you, and it's really in relation to yourself or your business. What do you think the industry's research imperative should be if we are to get green by 2050, or indeed by earlier than that if we want to get ahead of the curve? Because I'm genuinely of the opinion that 2050 is seen by a lot of people as being so far away that we shouldn't worry about it. Whereas in actual fact, we have a lot of low-hanging fruit in our industry, and we really could be way ahead of the curve if we got our act together. So I think the question of you is, what are we going to do from a research point of view to come up with the numbers that allow the people who are making the decisions to actually, get on and do something sooner?
Well, I think to a certain extent, the government, the current government, is halfway there in that they've identified a strategic benefit of going big in technology, in research, become a leader, and provide essentially multiple revenue opportunities to grow from being strong in a particular field. And so, were we to invest heavily in accelerating the development and application of new technologies into different areas, and I mean battery, hydrogen, but also cost-effective electrification, use of composite materials, all of that kind of stuff. Were we to go big as a country and say, right, we're going to really invest in this and we'll make the money back, not just through the cost savings and benefits generated from applying it in the UK, but becoming a world leader in that as well. And I know that at the moment, the context of UK saying it's world leading in this, world leading in that is a little bit tired, which is a shame. But on this one, we actually genuinely have the ability to, because we can apply all of this technology early and demonstrate it. And with those credentials, we can piggyback out into global markets with real value, real benefits of operation, and real opportunities for other countries to benefit from as well, because we know that all across the world, countries are looking for ways to decarbonize their transport networks, and rail in particular. And we know this from a University of Birmingham perspective. We are working with national governments across, let me just double check. So certainly Asia Pacific, yes, Australasia, Africa, across Europe, South and North America, every continent. Our rail research group at the University of Birmingham is working to support the ways of decarbonising rail transport. And that's something we as a nation should be following up on, because to a certain extent, us at the universities, us as the research groups, are the pathfinders for what technology we can then develop and take to market. And we've already made those connections into those markets. So that's what the government should do. That's what the rail supply industry should get the government to do. I go back to my point before, the industry is stymied by a complete lack of knowledge of where the government's going to turn next. And it really requires certainty, commitment, a long-term plan, and commitment to stick to the plan. None of this last-minute changing.
Yeah, and I think the other message that comes out of that quite clearly is that if we as a country are supposedly world leading by saying we're going to be the first to achieve this by 2050, then we need to actually make sure that our game is up there well before that, so that, if you like, other countries can take advantage of what we've done, as opposed to having to do it up by themselves to get to that point in 2050 also. So I think the point you're making as well is that, the sooner we get on with this, the better it will be.
Well, that's a given. Absolutely, yes.
Alex, it's been absolutely fascinating talking to you. Thank you so much for engaging with us and giving us your views on all of this. I love doing these podcasts. They're really brilliant because they not only, shall we say, open my mind to different perspectives, they also reinforce a lot of prejudices one has, which is always very good. But I think the fact is that all of us in the industry do have a feel for what should be done. And I think a lot of us feel frustrated that the messages that we have to give out sometimes and what we have to say doesn't quite accord with what we honestly believe in. And I think, what you've said to me is a really good indicator of what you believe in. I don't think you said anything you shouldn't have done there. So
thank you.
Really
thank you very much.
Really great talking to you, and thank you very much, Alex. Really.
No, thank you for having me. It's an important subject, and I agree with you. I think deep down we all know what rail needs to do, for sure. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks.